welcome to the first session at this year's Battle of Ideas. After the referendum, is Britain divided? I know everyone's going to be very keen to get stuck into this, and so I'm going to be very brief with my introductions. We've got a very eminent panel here, but I'm going to get straight to it with them, and then we're going to go straight out to the audience, because I know you're going to be keen to not just ask questions, but to make points and have some of your thoughts on this important issue. So just a brief introduction. It won't do them justice to the panel. On the far end, we've got Richard Angell, who's the Director of Progress. And as you'll know, Progress is the pressure group for New Labour. Directly next to Richard is Dr. Munira Mirza, who was formerly Deputy Mayor for Education and Culture and is also an author. Next to me here is Max Wind-Cowie, who will be speaking first today, and he's the Deputy Director of ResPublica, a non-partisan think tank. And next to Max is David Lammy, Member of Parliament for Tottenham, who's also an author. David Lammy. And on the far end is Mick Hume, who's editor-at-large of Spiked magazine and also a journalist and author. So, Max, can we start with you?
Certainly. It's always great to be at the Battle of Ideas because not only are the debates fractious and interesting and exciting, but they're also often relevant and timely, and there's no better example than this, I don't think. As was mentioned in the introduction, I work at ResPublica, which is a think tank, but I run the part of our work, ResPublica North, which focuses on looking at political and economic and cultural answers for the north of England. And the reason that we set up ResPublica North was primarily because between kind of Holyrood and Westminster, we think that there's a big old chunk of the country that represents, I suppose, the real squeezed middle, an area of the country that has been significantly underinvested in, significantly left behind in lots of ways, although often it's somewhat contentious to say that because people obviously feel an immense amount of justified pride in where they're from, but nonetheless have been left behind economically, and which, as we saw in the referendum, voted overwhelmingly to leave the European Union. 114 of 125, I think, counting areas in the north of England voted to leave. So I'm going to focus my brief remarks on that divide, the divide that I think exists between north and south, the divide that I think may have had a massive and profound impact on how this country voted in the European referendum. And also, I'm going to try and end with a little note of optimism about what I think can be done to help to heal some of the gap that's been created. I should say, by the way, that I voted to remain in the European Union. I did that out of a kind of sectional class interest, like most middle-class people who spend part of their time living in London. But I divide my time between North London and the north of England, and I think that gives a kind of insight into some of the issues that come up. And I would say that I voted to remain, but the reaction that we've seen from people who campaigned and voted to stay in the European Union since the vote went against them has been really quite extraordinary to watch. And I think that we all have to be really, really careful not to exacerbate the divides that we see and recognise and are talking about today in our country by seeming to wish to ignore and disrespect and disenfranchise a democratic decision just because it happened to go against what we hold dear. Anyway, in terms of the north-south divide element of this, I mean, as I say, the north voted quite overwhelmingly, quite resoundingly to leave. I think from talking to people who worked on both campaigns, it was as results in the north started to come in and the gap was bigger than people had understood that it would be between exit and remain, that people started to realise that actually the vote was going to be was going to go in the direction of the leavers. I think that what you see across the north of England, there's an economic geographer called Philip McCann who's published a book recently, and he talks in that about the incredible divide between productivity in the north and the south. And obviously when we talk about South, London has a massive, profound impact on that, but it's beyond just the metropole of London. It's throughout the southeast. There are parts of the north of England that have the same level of productivity as parts of ex-Soviet Eastern Europe. And that's a really profoundly impactful thing in people's daily lives because it means that wages are lower, it means there are less high-skilled, high-quality jobs, and there are less routes out of one job into another, if you see what I mean. There are less opportunities to climb a ladder in your life and to become good at and be paid well for and have levels of esteem for what you do professionally. It's also a reality that as in the south and in London, I think we've built kind of incredible cultural capital over the last 20, 30 years, be it in the arts. Munira's done lots of important work to promote that in London, but be it across a whole range of different areas. And actually across the north at the same time, what you've seen with the collapse of lots of traditional working class occupations and the associated kind of social and cultural institutions that came with them, you've seen a collapse in social solidarity, a collapse in connectivity between people that has had a real effect in terms of how people understand their role in the world. And I think that's been profoundly important too. And in terms of social policy and public services, I think there's no better kind of example of the kind of real lived divide between north and south in this country than when people start talking about education. You notice when we were talking about grammar schools, and for now, take or leave what you think about the plan on grammar schools such as it exists. But everyone gets saying, well, why can't we have the London model? In London, we don't have a selective education system. In London, grades are going up. People are achieving more and more every year. Some of the best schools in some of the poorest areas anywhere in the Western world. And all of that is true. You can't replicate that in Carlisle, where I'm from. You can't replicate that level of school choice, school competition. You can't replicate that density of people with different kind of interests and exciting ideas, etc. You can't. And because you can't, and because it's not possible to do it in the same way, you can't then start just lecturing people in the rest of the country about how if only they were a little bit more like London, and if only their public services were a little bit more like London's, then they'd do better out of things, they'd feel less anxious, they wouldn't care about immigration so much, etc. Because it's not replicable in that way. I think that's something that people like me and people who do thinking about policy for a living have made the mistake of not quite understanding fully, is that actually it's not just that the question is how do we get people in the north of England, get people in the rest of the UK to have some of the opportunities that people in London have. It's that you can't use the same policy interventions. And because you can't use the same policy interventions, people know that you're kind of fibbing when you tell them that it's all going to be all right through those mechanisms. I said I would end on a note of optimism, and that's what I plan to do. So I voted, as I say, to remain, but I do actually think that the result of the vote provides enormous and profound opportunities to start to heal some of this divide. I think something really interesting happened during the referendum campaign. And that's that this was actually a debate at the start between two kind of bits of the Liberal elite, Dan Hannan and Nick Clegg, right? They may disagree about a whole number of things, but they are cosmopolitan liberals, and they just have a different idea about how you reach an answer, about the best way to pursue laissez-faire, liberal capitalism and social settlement. That debate has been captured by a whole load of people, lots of whom I grew up with in the north of England, who have said, actually, no, we want a different set of answers. We want a different economic settlement. We want something that protects us and rescues us from globalization, not something that turns us into a kind of airstrip one of the financial services industry. And that's a really exciting thing. Leaving Europe gives us the opportunity to do something about it, and if we're going to heal the divide, that's what we have to do. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Max. Munira.
Just to explain my background, I campaigned for Leave during the referendum. I spoke on behalf of the official Vote Leave campaign at various events and in the media. And since the referendum, I've also helped set up an organisation called Change Britain, which continues a lot of the spirit of the official Vote Leave campaign. It's chaired by Gisela Stewart, who was the Labour MP who also chaired Vote Leave. And Change Britain is about bringing together people from across the political divide, across left and right, to try and make a success out of Brexit. And it also has access to the large grassroots network that was built during the Vote Leave campaign. I'm 38 years old, so I've seen about 25 years of general elections and referendums. And for me, the referendum campaign was one of the most extraordinary moments of political time in my very short life. But I think for many other people, it was an incredible, exciting, engaging campaign. And I was struck by how well-informed people were about the issues. There's a sort of a narrative that's running amongst some people in the media that the campaigns on both sides were built on lies and people regret what they decided and they didn't know, they weren't informed properly. Actually, my impression was quite the opposite, that many people, some for whom they dropped out of politics, they hadn't voted for a long time, were very engaged with the issues and were informing themselves. And certainly on the Leave side, there was a voluntary network of about 10,000 people built within a short space of a few months, which is quite an incredible feat, really. But I think that the people of Britain, on the whole, were very thoughtful about it, and a lot of people decided right up until the last moment, and they did watch TV debates, and they read articles, and they taught themselves. I think that they chose to engage with the issue in a way that perhaps is not always assumed of them. We often assume the worst of people when it comes to politics, but actually the British people, I think, did make their decisions in a reasonably well-informed way. What struck me during the campaign was that this was also not simply about economics, and it wasn't simply about immigration. Important though those issues were, it was also about ideas, and democracy, I think, did feature very highly in the debate. I remember watching one of the ITV debates with Michael Gove. It was Friday evening, 8 p.m. on ITV, and he was talking about democracy and the audience was cheering. I thought, what an incredible thing to be talking about democracy on primetime television, to have audience viewing figures that beat previous TV debates. And again, I think people were genuinely interested in ideas which up until then politicians perhaps had not really thought about discussing in general elections. So that makes it all the more depressing, the way that some politicians and high-profile figures since the referendum have reacted to the vote, the way that they have denigrated the people who did choose to vote Leave as being too stupid to understand the facts that they were given, to be able to interpret the so-called lies, or being racist, being bigots, just simply acting in a very knee-jerk, emotional way, wanting their country back, etc., as if they were really just reacting in an extremely primitive way. And we heard quite high-profile figures, not just in politics, but also in the arts, talking about bigots running the country and so on. And I think that that phrase, take back control, which featured throughout the referendum campaign, through the Vote Leave campaign, which was essentially about democracy, which was essentially about people taking back control, was rubbished as a kind of fantasy, and that people were kidding themselves that they were really taking back control over anything. It was a sneering attitude. Someone actually called it quite cleverly Project Sneer after referendum, which I thought was very witty. What the referendum itself and the outcome of the referendum, I think, exposed is that there is a divide in society. You could say it's a divide between the haves and the have-nots, between London and the rest of the country. Actually, though the demographic patterns show that poorer, less educated people tended to vote Leave, I think it's not a straightforward case that everybody in the north wanted to leave. There was, I have friends in Manchester who hadn't met a single person who voted Leave. They were all Remainers. So it's not quite a clear-cut division. But there clearly was a tribalism at work on both sides. And I think one of the issues that, of course, came to the fore in the referendum was about immigration. And how people responded to that issue, I think, was quite telling. Because obviously people's experiences informed their attitude to the whole project of the EU and to the campaign. And there are many people in this country who do look at immigration and feel that it has negatively impacted their lives in a particular way, and particularly in the last 20 years. They've seen a rapid growth of population in the areas in which they live. They feel that the public services haven't been able to accommodate that, and they're expressing serious concerns about that. And rather than engaging with it, trying to understand it, and perhaps even sympathising or empathising with it, a large group of people, mostly based in London, rubbished them and said that they were bigots for having those views. And it basically was a way of stamping down public debate about, I think, an incredibly important issue. And to dismiss it as racism seemed to be the easy way out of having that discussion. I thought it was very interesting that a lot of people who were in so-called progressive circles found it easier to side with the IMF, the World Bank, the OECD, Goldman Sachs, etc., rather than the people that they had traditionally always associated themselves with, which is the working class. And I guess the question that leaves us with is, what does it mean to be part of a nation? What does it mean to be part of a nation state? And the revelation that I had during the campaign was that nationalism is a boo word. It's a bogey word. It's a bogeyman word in London, in a certain kind of liberal elite circle. But actually, nationalism, at its most progressive, is a form of empathy with people who have different life circumstances to your own. And I thought it was very sad that that very simple human trait of empathy just didn't seem to be apparent in the aftermath of the referendum. And what nationalism should look like now, I don't know, but I think at the heart of it, it should have a sense of being able to relate to people who are very different to yourself and to be able to transcend those particular class or cultural divides that we might have.
Thanks, Munira.
I think it is worth starting when we're talking about why we're divided, that the reason why we had this referendum, because the Prime Minister of the day had a problem with his own party that he decided was too difficult to deal with himself and therefore gave to other people to decide for him. And not unreasonably, lots of those people have gone back and go, well, this is complex, you guys sort it out. And that's sometimes why we're in the issues that we're in now. I think that one of the things is it was a great democratic exercise in our country. Lots of people got engaged, which is one of the reasons why we're so divided now. People got invested in their particular outcome. And I think that's actually an important part of why it was, that people were passionate, they were principled, they were energised, they were excited, they had different ideas of their national identity, their nationalism, and how they wanted to pursue that in the modern age. So I think that is an important thing that we should actually cherish as part of it. So if we are to respect those who felt a sense of loss which led them to vote to leave, you can't now deny that there are people who voted to remain who feel they've had something taken from them that they cherish deeply, and that of course that's going to lead them to ask 100 more questions. And what I think is really sad about where we are is that the people who campaigned for us to leave, who themselves, if we had not have left or voted Brexit, would have gone round somehow in a Trump-esque way saying this was rigged or unfair, or this has been a kind of project for certain people for some time, to say that at every point that it's been kind of turned against them and that it was because certain people sided with a terrible group of international financial elites or whatever it might have been, that they would themselves be moaning quite a lot now and wanting a second or third referendum, as we're seeing with the nationalists in Scotland pretty damn quick, that it's not unreasonable that some of those people have felt a sense of loss and that they want some sense of reassurance. And that what's fascinating is from the people who have won, they are constantly doing a victory lap while saying the problem are the people who wanted to stay, who themselves feel that sense of loss now. So you've got a combination of things happening, and then some of us, and I voted to remain, look at the polls and see that a third of people who voted to leave think we have already left and the country is doing great, which suggests to me there wasn't much wrong a couple of weeks ago before the referendum if that's all the change that they kind of needed. But where we are now, it seems that we are more divided for a variety of reasons. One, in that the Brexit voters feel more sceptical of elites, having voted to leave, because they feel it's about to be taken away from them. They did something brilliant. Your campaign was extraordinary. It was a great success, and I think it was against the odds in lots of ways. And therefore, they still feel there's lots of trapdoors en route that somehow this elite is going to deny them of their choice, and I think that we should all be reflective on that. Equally, the Lexit people, the left exit group that were trying to say there was a kind of progressive way of leaving the EU, I think they've had their fox shot, because it turns out it doesn't look like there is one, and they have totally disappeared. So there isn't an alternative to the kind of UKIP mantra of what leaving might be, and I think that is very, very sad. The Brexit leadership are just not generous in the way they have behaved since. There's a number of things that people could have done. The Prime Minister, in her speech to Tory party conference, could have said a variety of things that might have reassured some of those who voted Remain. For example, of course we're going to leave, and she had her tests of being out of the courts and out of the political institutions, but she could have said, for example, we want to stay as part of the Erasmus scheme, because we're not going to end the idea of knowledge cooperation and young people going to train and learn at other universities around the EU, and that would have been a positive. She could have, for example, said that we would remain having freedom of movement for under 23, so our younger generation, who overwhelmingly did vote to remain, but want to have the best of a globalised world, not just within Europe but beyond, could have that opportunity to seek those challenges early on, but you wouldn't see the big movements of people that look like they have the implications of undercutting wages or kind of coming to claim benefits that go with it that would be quite a strong thing. They could have said very quickly, and every one of them should have said, that EU citizens here should remain and we're not using them as a bargaining chip. And I think, quite frankly, all of them should have been out there at that Polish community centre after the racism that took place in a big and strong fashion, because there has been a rise of racism in this country. And I think there are people across the divide who voted in different directions who are understandably concerned about that, but they seem crucial people seem not concerned enough, which I think is difficult. Finally, and I'll kind of end it on this point, is that we did vote to take control, But we can't deny that we have lost some of the control over the consequences. That was what part of being in the EU did, is that we were part of negotiating not just what we wanted, but how others might react to it, and we're going to lose that. But what the leave will look like is really up for dispute. And the key thing is the people who are in Vote Leave or Leave.eu don't agree themselves. There are 22 or something different opinions amongst the cabinet themselves, but for some reason, the executive of this country thinks they have a monopoly on interpreting what you, the British people, decided on the 23rd of June. And I don't think that is possibly right. And that doesn't mean I want a parliamentary process that can frustrate leaving, but we must have a democratic process that discusses what leaving, because while we will want to take control of many things, it will still be right to cooperate on many more. And I think the Prime Minister was right to say, for example, on the European arrest warrant, that will be an important part of our security that we want to still work with our neighbours on. There must be others. Erasmus is one I've suggested, but there will be many, many others. And there will be things that weren't, I think, part of the debate, where cooperation will be the best way of going forward and that people could work together to make that happen. But I think now that the Bramonas, as we have been labelled, and I think it is slightly unfair to say to people that have got serious and legitimate questions about a very big choice that came down to a few simple words, to kind of write them off in that way. But crucially, some people won, and normally in a democracy, when you win, you don't do a victory lap and rub people's noses in it. You actually extend the hand of friendship to your neighbours who didn't vote the same way as you, and you try and build it together, and I'm looking for that leadership.
Thank you. Thank you, Richard. David.
I want to try and be optimistic, but I'm afraid I'm struggling. And I guess I'm struggling because I'm very conscious that I'm sitting here on the panel as a very identifiable ethnic minority who feels absolutely British and feels that our country is more divided than I've ever seen it. One of the toughest tweets that I've had over this last 4 months was someone who said, "Why do you hate England so much?" And that really affected me. I grew up in Tottenham. I spent half my life in Peterborough. I love Tottenham Hotspur, which takes some effort as a Briton. I feel very, very British and adore this country and adore a country that my parents helped to build after the Second World War. But I think this country is more divided than I've ever seen it, and I'm not clear how it gets out of this pickle, but the course we're on, I suspect, is not going to get us out of it. It's the case that we're divided by region. London, Manchester, Leeds, Liverpool, Newcastle voted to remain. Yes, there is a north-south divide. I have to say, I think that north-south divide existed long before this vote. But actually, the bulk of votes that will remain were largely Conservative voters living in the shires. They are much bigger in numbers. It's the people of Surrey, of Hampshire, of Gloucestershire, of Oxfordshire that in bulk voted largely to leave. There is a divide generationally with a lot of young people, I think, and I see many in this audience, deeply concerned about a future that they've been excluded from, that their parents and grandparents enjoyed in terms of their relationship with Europe. And there is an ethnic divide as well. 75% of black Britons voted to remain, 67% of Asians in this country voted to remain as well. So how do we come back together? I don't see how we can come back together very easily with an unelected Prime Minister without a personal mandate and a Brexit decision, and you've heard how it happened. It happened largely because David Cameron had a management problem in his own party, and it's very worrying that those that set up this referendum, David Cameron, Michael Gove, Nigel Farage, have largely exited the stage. But what was clear is that what Brexit involves, the detail of Brexit, is not something that people voted for or fully understood. Now, I represent a very deprived constituency. I've spent a lot of time in deprived constituencies across the country that are different to my own. And so I suppose in the front of my mind is the economic effects of this decision, because I've been in politics long enough to know that those who suffer the most are most often the poorest. And my sense is that the big divisions that exist in our country have existed for some considerable time. It has largely been the case since empire that Britain's global elite, those who are educated and go to university, are very tapped into the global world. Indeed, the reason I'm here is largely because of slavery, but the population of Britain, the mass, are not. It has always been the case that in these islands that have not been invaded since 1066, we've got large communities that are very sedentary, that remain in their village, remain in their town, don't move, but you have a ruling class that move quite a lot. That has always been the case. And there is a paternalism that's existed in Britain and European countries. It goes, you just have to watch Downton Abbey and the way in which the aristocrat run his manor. You can go back to the great industrialists, the Unilevers, the Cadburys, and the birth of the welfare state. That has largely disappeared, and that journey begun with Margaret Thatcher. It's interesting that it is Thatcherite that hitched us to this global direction on which we have gone. We're hearing a lot about grammar schools. I don't want to hear about grammar schools. I want to hear about night schools. Find me a college in Britain that's open after 7:30 where working people, black and white, can go and skill up and train up to access the economy, and I'll give you a beer. Whose fault is that? Europe's? I don't think so. That's the fault of successive governments. And you can take it back to, and I'm Labour and Conservatives, where a ruling metropolitan elite have ruled in their own interest. London has benefited hugely from being in the EU. The fact that the money has not dispersed is not the EU's fault. If anything, the EU was giving some subsidy to Cornwall, to Wales, to the North East. Now it's all going to dry up. So now we will be dependent on our leaders. And good luck to you if you believe that Theresa May is going to spread the proceeds of growth. In recession, in the economic downturn that is to come, the possibility of spreading that growth will be diminished. Less people will be employed, so there will be less receipts. The pound is falling. Recession is coming in the first quarter of next year. We are in desperate, desperate trouble. And the way that you bring us back together is not the course that we are set on.
Thank you, David. And Mick.
Good morning. I am a signed-up member of the unofficial Leave campaign. I'm an old libertarian Marxist who's spent the last 15 years or so writing and campaigning around the slogan for Europe against the EU, which I think is an important distinction between Europe and the EU, which is often lost sight of in these discussions. I want to talk about the divide, not in terms of the demographics or the economics, but in terms of the political and cultural values that I think most importantly divide people in the debate about the EU. And secondly, since the EU's referendum, have really brought out an even more important division in our attitude towards democracy and the meaning of democracy in our society. There was a very revealing episode last month on the Radio 4 Today programme, which I don't listen to, but it was pointed out to me as an interesting episode, where someone who'd been doing focus groups, a company been running focus groups since the referendum, came on to report their findings of interviewing people on both sides of the divide. And they were asked, what did the Leave voters think of the Remainers? And they said many of the Leave voters thought the Remainers were rich people, and that's why they voted to Remain, which is, we can agree, a slight oversimplification. Although, as the Daily Telegraph headline of a report recently pointed out, Britain's ruling classes, by which they mean anybody who earned over 60 grand, were the only ones who voted overwhelmingly in favour of Remain. So that's what some of the Leavers thought of the Remainers. On the other side, what did the Remainers think of the Leavers? And the woman in question reported that the Remainers thought that some of the Leavers, quote, were stupid and shouldn't have the vote. Not just stupid, but stupid and shouldn't have the vote. And that, I think, is a political and cultural divide that I'm talking about. I see the referendum as a revolt of the others, of the so-called deplorables, of those who've been left behind, not purely in economic terms, because many of them weren't, the bottom of the pile economically, but left behind politically and culturally by the changes that have taken place in our country over the last 20 years. There was a BBC political advisors report just before the referendum came out, very interesting, which I think threw a lot of light on this, talked about the way in which millions of people who don't share what he called metropolitan values see themselves as ignored and despised by the elite. And he made the point that the metropolitan political class seems completely bewildered and at a loss about how to respond. Who are these ghastly people and where do they come from doesn't really hack it. That was a report done before the referendum, and I think his findings are very much borne out in the referendum result about that divide. And the reaction to it, when the majority of people stood firm, remarkably firm, against all of the threats and warnings issued by the entire political class about why they must vote Remain, stood firm and the majority voted for Leave. The reaction, I think, was really brought this divide to the fore in terms of the fury and disbelief which was poured down on the heads of the kind of Leave voters as being, as Munira says, that they were ignorant, over-emotional, bigoted, racist, misled by demagogues, etc., etc. Someone sitting not a million miles from me, our MP, David, issued a statement. It sounds very reasonable today. He issued a statement immediately after the referendum, which he said, "We can stop this madness.
It is madness.
And bring the nightmare to an end through a parliamentary vote." Democracy as madness, the nightmare of losing an argument. It just seemed that there was a lot of people in the political class that couldn't really face that fact. And it couldn't be that people had simply weighed up the facts, decided for themselves and disagreed with the political class. It had to be that they'd been misled by lies and liars, and basically they don't know what's good for them, and that they should not really have the right to make the wrong choices. This is an argument, by the way, which is not new. It's been around. Every anti-democrat since Plato has put forward the same argument, that ordinary people are not capable of making big decisions, and it should be left to those who know better to make those decisions. And what's the difference between Plato and today is that it's no longer just aristocrats and overt elitists who make these arguments, but those who make it most forcefully tend to be, shamefully, in my opinion, on the liberal and the left side, or see themselves that way, of the argument. You've only got to look at someone like the great humanist Richard Dawkins' response to the referendum campaign, when he showed what this great humanist really thinks of most of humanity, when he talked about stupid, ignorant people and why unqualified simpletons should not be left to take decisions about such major and important matters. And then we've seen this political alliance to try to reverse or undermine the referendum result across party lines, from Ed Miliband to Nick Clegg and the Tory Baroness Wheatcroft in the House of Lords. And what's interesting is, what's distinctive about today is we live in a world where no one can be against democracy. You can't, it's like motherhood and apple pie. You can't come out and say you're against democracy. So the argument against the referendum result is posed in terms of democracy, that we have to uphold parliamentary democracy and parliamentary sovereignty, which is interesting because it never seemed to bother most of these people when parliamentary sovereignty was being undermined via the EU, whether by British governments or Brussels bureaucrats. It seems they only want to defend parliamentary sovereignty when it comes to defending it against the people who voted in an exercise of direct democracy in the referendum. And the fact that they want to retreat to the Lords to try and do this, I think, is particularly interesting. Baroness Wheatcroft made the point that one reason why the Lords was well qualified to lead a rebellion against Brexit was, she said, because we have no constituents to fear. Fear and loathing of the electorate is what kind of unites them across the lines. You've seen this all over social media. Quite interesting observation that where everyone who's been trying to compare Donald Trump to Brexit. And the interesting thing was that actually a rather different comparison came out this week when Donald Trump said he would only accept the election result if he won, which seemed to be very similar to the result of many of those on the Remain side of that debate. I think the bigger issue now, an even bigger issue than the divide over at the EU, is the divide over the future of democratic politics. The referendum's a great moment for democracy in this country, when people participated in debate where they hadn't done before, and they all come out and said that afterwards. And we need to find ways to build on that. If we're going to overcome these divides, we need to have a very open, political, public, democratic debate. And we need to find ways to breathe life back in democracy. And finally, we should remember, in its origins in Greece, the word democracy comes from two components: demos, the people, and kratos, power. And for too often in this country, what is called democracy has meant separating one from the other, separating people from power. And what we need to find if we're going to overcome this divide is a way to have bring democracy to life in a debate that can put the demos back into democracy. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. I want to go straight out to the audience.
Yeah, my question's for David Lammy. You're a Member of Parliament. That means serving for the people. I've seen your speeches straight after the vote, and you actually said if there was a vote in Parliament, you would vote against the Brexit decision, the vote against the people. Can you justify that?
Here's my theory on the divide from the Brexit vote. Never before in electoral history has the upper middle class, otherwise known as the establishment, lost an election. They may like a Labour government or a Tory government and prefer that in the past, but it's pretty much same old, same old. No power, there's been no disjuncture of power, nothing's been stripped from people. You know, Blair came along, that satisfied everyone living in Notting Hill. And the Brexit vote is the first time that class of people, and of course it's not well defined, has actually lost. This was prefaced as well by Jeremy Corbyn's rise to the leadership of the Labour Party, which stripped the upper middle class and establishment control of one of the two main political parties of power. And so you've lost control of that. And if you, Richard, want to know why...
I'm not upper middle class.
Well, you're part of your progress is part of the establishment. But
Hold on, don't let this get out of control.
My point on this is the reason why people are very suspicious of elites is because they can see what happened in the Labour Party when someone who doesn't represent those establishment interests rises to power. Dark forces move against them. It's the same thing with Brexit. The establishment has been beaten, and it's the first time they've ever suffered a proper defeat, and they don't know what's going on. Luckily for the establishment, the opposition and people who voted Brexit are pretty incoherent and weak, I'll give you that. But that's what's happened, and that's the real divide. The establishment and the upper middle class elite have lost an election for the first time in history.
Okay, thank you.
I have a question for Richard, and my question is, does he think Ed Balls is a good dancer? Tonight we're going to be, I hope, watching, cheering former Labour politician try and survive on Strictly in a way that he didn't manage to in 2015's general election, where the people of Leeds decided that they would rather vote for UKIP than endorse him in a marginal constituency. And the reason I make this point is because you have already been warned, Labour politicians such as Richard Angell and David Lammy MP. You've already seen the anger that exists outside the capital on, amongst other things, this particular issue. And you've seen, and you're going to watch tonight, the consequences of deciding to moan and continue on this particular issue. The answer is, of course, a huge bleeding of votes to UKIP and the Conservatives, particularly in that 75% of seats which are Labour held but are in districts that decided to vote to leave. So my question to you, particularly you, Richard, after using comments such as there is no alternative, UKIP, rise of racism and all of that sort of stuff, is, are you a good dancer?
I live in the home counties. I live in Surrey. Most of my friends are particularly well off. We mostly run our own businesses. We are very intellectual, and we all vote to leave. So these average numbers, average is grim, basically. You're lumping all sorts of people into buckets that don't actually belong there. We didn't vote for any of the reasons that you're all talking about, actually. We looked outside, we looked to Europe, we looked to globalization, we looked to the unethical, immoral behavior of companies like Goldman Sachs, Google, and the others, and we didn't like what we saw. We don't like it, and we looked outside, and so we don't want to be part of that. We think Europe's a failed experiment, as is large corporations. Bigger, bigger, bigger is not better, better, better.
So we've got a Prime Minister who was a Remainer. The likelihood is that it's going to be a soft exit, and that the change that people thought they were voting for when they voted Brexit is not going to happen. That's the likelihood, because the economic risks associated with a hard Brexit are just too great. So my question is what the nation will look like, and what that divide will look like when that realisation that change is not on the horizon dawns.
I was wondering if, when Richard asks us to repudiate the spike in racist incidents after the Brexit vote, which is itself contested, whether he also asks us to reject Stephen Bell's cartoon in The Guardian, where he depicted half the population of this country who voted to leave as rats vomiting into the sewer of public life, or into the river of public life.
I hate every one of his cartoons,
anyway.
so I can be very clear about
my
I love
point,
political cartoons.
Okay, I've heard your answer.
Of all of them.
I live and work in a small town with two very large universities. The population of that town, I think, have legitimate concerns about the growing expansion of those universities. I don't think that makes them anti-immigrant. I don't think that makes them racist. It makes them concerned about resources, amenities. They might welcome expansion, but it's never been put to them. And so they democratically are concerned about the influx that occurs around that. And I think I was very curious to hear Munira talking about nationalism in what sounded as potentially positive terms. I'd like to, if you can, to expand upon what you mean by that, because I think the others have been given quite a fair amount of questions already. Although I would ask David, you ask for unity. Unity around what?
No, it's a fair point.
So a number of questions there. Aside from the dancing, the point about to what extent voters are going to UKIP and others, and what that actually means for Labour, and or any of the other points that came up, Richard.
I went to see Kinky Boots last night, which is a great musical that I commend to all of you, and it kind of revived my inner camp, and thought if I need a career change, maybe a drag queen is a good way going forward. So hopefully my dancing shoes might be coming out soon. But look, I think there is a problem here in that there is a new elite now. You know, the country is run by somebody who is committed to Brexit. You know, she was only just on the Remain side anyway. You've got the Foreign Secretary, the head of the Exit Department, the guy for international trade, and most of the people with the levers of power and the consequences of leaving, whether it's international development or the Environment Department, or whatever, that are run by Brexiteers. And now the questions are for them. And what comes from some of Mick's comments towards myself and David Lammy is that if you don't want to give over the detail to Parliament and our parliamentary democracy to come out with what kind of Brexit that we had, is that otherwise you literally give a monopoly to the Cabinet, which is a pretty right-wing group of people, to decide on behalf of all of us what they want the direction of travel to be. And the reality is that there was everyone from Nigel Farage through to, I don't know, who's the most Remain person, Peter Mandelson, whatever, that voted in that election, and 52% of them crowded on one side. They didn't all want kind of cut off with the borders, kind of, which some people will have wanted. There is a huge and divergent view within Vote Leave. Geezer Stewart's view through to Munira's or others will be highly different about what kind of leave they wanted. Mick's view of being kind of in Europe but not in the EU or whatever it was, that will be a very different vision for Britain outside of that working together than what Nigel Farage clearly wanted. So there is a big debate about what people wanted and how it is delivered, and quite frankly, there is some trade-offs with the kind of economic opportunities we're going to have. And there is a kind of, those of us who voted to Remain, in some ways are caught between a kind of, well, let's just let this go the way it is. Go on, have all of the, in some ways I want a hard Brexit. So let's see what it is. Let's see what this gives the country. But at the same time, I think, well, do I really want to do that? Because I think we'll have really tragic consequences. And say what you will about my position, I believe it really strongly. I hold the conviction that the only way to stand up to Google and big corporations, because there is no vote on closing down big corporations, is to have a club of nations that can somehow regulate the way that they tax and treat people, the way they have workers' rights, whatever. You don't have to agree with me, but I do hold that really sincerely as a belief, and I will continue to argue that working together as nations is the only way to hold big corporations to account, because individual nation states don't have the power they once did in a globalised age. And I'm allowed to be principled about that. You're all allowed to tell me I'm wrong. That is the nature of our democracy. But that what is happening is, by the people who led our vote to leave, many of which are now very important, who were prepared to say things they knew that were untrue, they knew that 350 million a week wasn't going to go to the NHS, for example, is they are trying to set up that we who voted to remain are the problem. This is their problem, they're in charge, let them sort it out.
All right, thank you, David. I mean, the question about people have concerns and considerations, and rather than perhaps name-calling, addressing them and being put to them, is that a fair point? Do you accept that? I mean, there's been a lot discussed about how people have been talked about in the run-up to the referendum and post it. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, it's indicative of the hugely divided country that we're living in which we're almost like tribes that demonize others in different positions. I mean, the two last contributions I find myself very sympathetic to. I absolutely recognize huge concerns about global capital, about terrible taxation, about a deep unfairness with both the sort of corporate elite and a metropolitan elite that don't pay their tax, and everybody else who sort of PAYE who has to pay their tax. My problem is much of that decision-making is domestic. Much of that is about your domestic politicians deciding on a very, very clear global capitalist laissez-faire approach that takes that view. In fact, often I've been in a European context, and it is Britain arguing passionately against other European countries for the most laissez-faire approach to global capitalism. So I think Richard's point is right. In the end, you have to ask yourself, and let's remember, Nigel Farage worked in the city. You've got to ask yourself whether you trust those individuals on your behalf to make those decisions, or have you been duped? When I'm told that I'm an anti-democrat, it's my job to represent my constituents who voted overwhelmingly to remain. I believe in our parliamentary democracy. I have huge concerns with plebiscites. Plebiscites have been used for the most awful. Hitler used them terribly in the run-up to the Second World War. So be very, very careful about... If you want to be governed by plebiscite, if we want that kind of new constitutional arrangement, if you want the British public to get into the detail and vote on... Let us try and frame that, but it's going to be very difficult. I actually think at the moment, if you came back to Parliament, Parliament would vote to leave, because most members of Parliament... their constituents voted to leave, but at least you would bring some debate, some discussion, and then we get on to it, or you have a general election. But where we are at the moment is that in the end, whilst this is being portrayed as the people voted to leave, actually it was close. A substantial part of the electorate did not vote to leave, and there are many leavers who now say, oh God, I was just sending a message. I didn't realise that this was going to happen to the economy. That's the truth of it. So how do we come back together? How do we get into the detail? Do you really trust those on your behalf to get into that? Do you just want to leave it to the cabinet? I would recommend to you, you don't. How do we get out of this fix? And don't call me an anti-democrat for standing up for my constituents. Yeah. I want it to be back in Parliament, but I don't say that my view will prevail. I simply say that's the arena we've come up with constitutionally to deal with these things, and I think it's going to be very, very difficult to govern permanently by referenda.
Okay, thank you. I want to ask Munira a question about the nationalism point, and also about this idea of solidarity and what it means, and can it mean something? Are we really so divided? Are we really that tribal, or is there some sense in which we can have a common purpose or not? And is that what you meant in your point about nationalism, or if not, could you explain it a bit, please?
I think a lot of people in the referendum accuse the Leave campaigners, or people who voted Leave, wanted to vote Leave, as being Little Englanders and retreating into an island mentality, i.e. cutting off from the rest of the world. I liked your point on the lady on the front row, that actually for a lot of people leaving the EU was about getting out of a sinking ship and engaging internationally with the rest of the world, and wanting to and to wanting to have the freedom and the autonomy to be able to make decisions about how to engage with other countries. In a strange way, the caricature of the Leave voters as being overly nationalistic, misunderstood that for them, their nationalism, their desire for independence and autonomy was the precursor to being truly international, to being able to truly engage with the rest of the world. And I think that's a relationship between the nation state and more international solidarity that a lot of people just don't understand, that the nation state was the beginning of a sense of solidarity for people. It's not the end of it, it's not the only identity we ever have, it's not the only kind of allegiance we ever have, but it is an important allegiance. And I found myself throughout the campaign saying things like, as a country, do we not want to understand what's going on in the north, what's going on in cities outside London? And people in London, not all of them, but a lot of people in London, being completely disinterested in the rest of the country, talking only about how London has to lead the way, only London is left in this racist island, and showing both ignorance about the state of the rest of the country and complete lack of empathy. And, that word solidarity seemed to be lacking in our public debate. Can I just pick up on a couple of other points? I think the distinction between soft and hard Brexit is a bogus distinction invented by people who voted Remain. Essentially, it's about leaving the single market. I think it was pretty clear to everyone throughout the campaign that we have to leave the single market if we want to take back control over law, money and borders. If the EU wants to give us a deal where we can have access to the single market and have those things, then great. But I think most people understood when they voted that was the choice on the table. For those people who say, Remainers talk about how demonised they feel now by the Leave campaign, and that we're calling them names and we're making them feel bad about the position they took.
It's having concerns now.
No, of course you have concerns. I completely understand that, and I think we should try and bring everyone together on this journey. But frankly, there are some people in the Remain camp who are arguing about overturning democracy. How on earth do you think the British people are going to feel if you turn around to them and say, actually, it's a bit difficult, we think we might just stay in the single market now because we didn't like the decision that you came up with. What do you think that does to people's trust in the political order, people's trust in democracy? I'll tell you where it leads to. It leads to Marine Le Pen. It leads to Donald Trump. It leads to extremist parties that want to, who have a very different attitude to democracy. And it's precisely the things that you are saying that Leave voters want, which will happen if we try and overturn the results of the referendum. And I think that you have to understand that that is why people react to calls that David Lammy and others are making about trying to change this decision. Sorry, just one final point, very quickly. I don't think this idea that people feel that they've had their EU taken away from them, that people love the EU. Actually, if you look at polls throughout the last year, before the vote, most people didn't like the EU. In fact, I suspect a lot of people would have voted to leave had it not been for the fear about the economic impact. And I suspect if you poll people now, be careful what you wish for. A second referendum might not give you the result you want either.
Thank you. Max.
A couple of brief points. And I think that it still surprises me, maybe because I didn't actually care very much, right? So I'm just going to admit I didn't really care very much about the referendum. I voted to Remain because, it seemed like a sensible thing to do. I feel neither a passion for the European Union nor a passion for the great onward march of sovereignty. That probably means that I'm distinctly ill-qualified to be sat up here. But I would say that, nobody in this room is Hitler. And nobody in this room is Marine Le Pen. And the idea that somehow either side in this debate represents some kind of extraordinary existential threat to our democracy, I just think it's such nonsense. I just don't understand this at all. It's absolutely true this was a great moment of democratic engagement, right? People voted, people were genuinely emotional about it. There were people crying on the streets of Stoke Newington, where I happened to be having dinner that night. That great moment of democracy, as Mick said, we need to work out how we continue that. How do we continue to think about the questions that were asked, the divides that were opened up? We surely don't continue all of that and benefit from it by going, right, that's it, you've had your say. We voted to leave, and now no one's going to discuss it again until something happens. That just seems to me to be an absolutely bizarre proposition. But that being said, I do think that people like David, great parliamentarians, he's my MP, by the way, probably do need to ensure that they're communicating with people in a way that says, look, I get to carry on having my view because I've not been castrated by the British people in terms of my politics and my ideas and my principles. But I'm not going to try and completely overturn what it is that you clearly expressed that you wanted. The only other thing that I would say, I really want to emphatically agree with something that Munira said. So there's a debate to be had, I think, there's a massive debate to be had, an ongoing debate forever about what Britain looks like outside of the EU, because we're going to leave the EU and then we're going to have loads of elections and think about things and do all that stuff. And there's huge opportunities, actually. There's huge opportunities to do the sort of things that we couldn't do before, around state aid, for example, which might have meant that we would have been able to protect properly some of the steel manufacturing in this country that has been left completely cut adrift by globalisation, right, and by the free market. We can't intervene in the sort of ways that even a kind of Tory like me would like to be able to because of the way in which the European Union governs us. So let's not pretend, in terms of the economic argument, that this will only leave people worse off. It can leave people fundamentally better off in lots of very interesting, exciting ways. But I would agree with Munira about something. There is no such thing as a soft Brexit. There is no kind of, ideal, weird thing that we do where we kind of leave and we don't leave and we exist in two parallel states at the same time and it's all like something that can happen only in the Large Hadron Collider. That's not realistic, right? We are leaving the EU. I totally disagree. I don't know where this idea is that Theresa May is secretly wandering around battling for a soft exit. Absolutely. I mean, you may know lots more about it than I do. I'm just me. But I think that isn't my impression. My impression is that what is going to happen is that we are going to leave the EU, we're going to leave the single market, and then we're going to see where we're at, and we're going to see what we can do in order to try and mitigate some of the undoubted damage that will do, but also take some of the huge opportunities that will give us to do lots of really left-wing things, Richard. And that's really exciting.
Okay, thanks. I'm going to... In a minute, I'm going to come back out. But on top of what you want to respond to, Mick, I want to ask you a question as well, because you make the point about how people were talked about and ghoulish and all of that. But there has been a trend in the last 2 decades about people talking about people being disconnected and disenfranchised and everything. Do you see this current thing that's happened being a resuscitation politically of people, or is it the case that Britain is irrevocably divided, in your opinion?
First of all, David gets the award. I can't remember what they called it. There's an award online, isn't there, for the first person to mention Hitler in any debate. David gets that one today. On the democracy issue, you see, I don't trust Theresa May at all. I'm not a Tory, and I certainly don't trust Theresa May. I think she's a Remainer. Her Chancellor is a Remainer. Her Foreign Secretary is a lifelong Remainer who decided he was a leaver for the personal purposes during the referendum campaign. They need to have their feet kept to the fire. The problem is, and I think there's a problem with the attitude to democracy on both sides of that parliamentary discussion. See, on one hand, you've got those who say Parliament is sovereign and Parliament must vote on this, which I'm not against. I think, in the end, let's have them all line up and say which side they're on in these things. I think people should be called out. But the clear motivation behind most of that is, let's have a vote on this in order to reverse it or undermine it, or do something to prevent the people's will being carried out, to soften it in some way. So suddenly people who have never been bothered about parliamentary sovereignty before are very excited about it because they want to defend it against the people's vote in a referendum. But on the other side, you have Theresa May and the government who say, no, we're not having any of that, because actually Parliament is not sovereign in this country. We have a sovereign, the clue is in the name, and that gives us the Crown prerogative, which means we as the government can pretty much do what we like on these big issues. And that's been the case for all governments. And that is a very serious problem for democracy in our country. And it's a device that's been used by, again, many of those people complaining about what Theresa May's refusal to discuss this with others. I've never had a problem with the Crown prerogative in the past when it enabled Labour governments to do what they wanted in Iraq or anywhere else. Neither side wants to actually have a proper, open, public, political, democratic debate about this. And that's what we need. And for me, that's a much more important issue than the exact terms of any deal with the EU. It's the future of democratic politics in this country that's at stake. And the danger is, in attitudes put forward by both of those people, that the Leave voters, or indeed all voters, are left behind again. We're left out. That's the point about Theresa May's monopoly of the whole thing has been a private affair, that we are supposed to sit and watch the TV news in the evening to find out what's going on in these kind of momentous editions. So in response to your question, Alan, I think it's not an irrevocable divide, but the only hope of deciding the future of the country properly is democracy, is an open, public, democratic debate about it. And the point about democracy is it's based on divisions. But in the end, you have a resolution and you decide which way the country is going. And that's what we need more of, rather than either parliamentary posturing or secret Crown prerogative manoeuvring.
I just want to say a big thank you to Mick, because I voted to remain. I'm immigration for this country because I'm from Cyprus. I had the right to vote because I'm a colony. Everyone here voted leave or remain for their own reasons. But I think the answer to this debate was Mick just saying about democracy and having an open democratic debate about that, because I'm a Remainer, he's a leaver, and we have just seen that what we both want is how are we going to keep going on with this thing. I respect that the country voted leave, but my question and my generation's question is, what now? What happens now? And that's what I didn't really get in this debate, because I'm 25 years old, and I don't see, like we're talking about Jeremy Corbyn and Nigel Farage. I don't care about this stuff right now. I want to know what now. Like, this is past. What's now? Because we're being run by Theresa May. It's a parliament, a member of parliament that we haven't voted for, and I want to know what now.
Okay.
So I'm 13, and we had in our school referendum, and 83% of our year. So that, yeah, 83% of our year voted to remain. And kind of want to know why the division's there. So why? I don't know if it's where we live, because I live in Buckinghamshire, I go to a grammar school, or if it's to do with the age. Why are so many of the younger generation trying to remain?
Why do you think?
Well, I'm not sure personally, but I'm not. Okay. My family voted leave, so I'm just not entirely sure why so many want to remain.
Okay, thank you.
For me, the main division is the division between people who believe in the democratic outcome of the referendum and people who don't. And the problem in terms of even the broader political debate around Brexit and the future of our economy is that a majority of people in the Cabinet, in the House of Commons, in the Tory party, in the intelligentsia and in the media don't want us to leave the EU. They never wanted us to leave the EU. They still don't want us to leave the EU. And there are two consequences of that which are very damaging for the future of our country. The first one is around the EU itself, because the reason that there appear to be such indecision and lack of clarity is because the people who are in charge don't want to leave. They are, imagine you were in that position, that you were in a position where you were making decisions about something that you didn't want to do in the first place. What you do is you think of all the reasons why you can't do it. And that's what's going on at the moment. All the problems that are being raised could be resolved and should have been resolved already by us invoking Article 50 the day after the referendum. That's what the people wanted, and that is now 3 months down the road and at least 6 months further down the road. Okay, so all this indecision is confusing people, and it's taking attention away from the bigger problems we face, which are to do with the general direction of our economy, productive investment, future plans of how we're going to become a good country again for the benefit of all our people. The moment the debate is much too narrow, it's foot dragging on the part of the establishment. Who knows when we will leave the EU? We need a much broader political debate which goes way beyond things like the single market.
Thank you. Okay.
David Axe from Invoke Democracy Now. It strikes me that we're discussing Britain divided, but it seems to me that the divisions have been promoted by people who wanted us to remain within the EU. So obviously, as has been discussed on the panel, we're told that the reason why people voted to leave was they were too racist, they were ill-educated, and what strikes me as almost the worst in some ways is that they were too old. The majority of over 65s voted to leave the EU. I mean, how far down the barrel do you have to scrape to come up with that line of argument that my parents or possibly your grandparents' generation are so beyond the pale that we can't discuss these issues with them. That somehow they are the other.
Who are you saying said this? Yeah.
I think it's a very strong. Well, I mean, I'm sure other people will. Nick Clegg, for example, Nick Clegg's a good example of this. He's made very similar arguments. And obviously we've got there's a long history of this particular discussion that the post-war, the baby boom generation, has benefited at the expense of young people. So there are, that's the argument, and I think that's obviously one of the arguments that needs to be addressed.
Okay, thank you.
This country has had EU membership for I think about 40 years. It's also had neoliberal economics for about 40 years as well. The purpose of neoliberal economics is to shift power from the poorest to the richest. That's what it's for. And I think to some extent you could say the EU contributes to that. But I'm just wondering whether a lot of the things people blame the EU for are actually to do with neoliberal economics. That's my point.
I'm going to be a bit blunt, but people have spoken very articulately and well about democracy and sovereignty, but in the end the EU was a vote on immigration, and whoever you spoke to was all about taking back control and immigration. And you can chart, I know statistics can prove everything, but if you chart where had least net immigration tended to voted for to leave. So, and we talk about democracy. The question really is Brexit a symptom of a larger trend in which our systems around our democratic systems, such as the media, have actually contributed more to that division than Brexit itself?
Hi, my name's Alice, and I'm part of the Echo Chamber Club. Something that's been really absent here is the role of technology and access to information. We've been talking a lot about political and economic reasons why Brexit happened, but nothing on echo chambers, filter bubbles. What role has Facebook got to play in this?
I think an important question that hasn't yet been discussed is when should a decision be put to referendum? I don't think it's undemocratic to say that some people are better informed than others on, say, the consequences of leaving the EU. And I believe we vote a parliament to become well informed on these issues and make a decision in the best interests of the country. I don't think most voters have quite realised the implications of what leaving the EU would do, and we're going to have a lot of surprises in store for the majority of the populace.
For me, the real big issue when we talk about a divide is actually the divide now in progressive politics. I think it's deeply worrying and deeply sad, actually, because I don't understand why we're romanticising this decision. This was one referendum. The establishment didn't lose this vote. The establishment's not a united group. There are elements in the establishment who have always wanted to shift income away or wealth away from that created through wages and earnings to that created through shares. They saw the EU as actually hindering that, just like they saw trade unions as hindering it. So the question is, why are we seeing it like that? Why are we romanticising it? I'm quite happy to tell people they were wrong. That doesn't make me undemocratic to say that.
My question is, do you think people are well educated before they actually voted? Because I'm 16 and my generation right now will only vote to Remain just because they don't want to spend £1 on Haribos because they want to keep it 50p because they're scared of hyperinflation. So, yeah.
I'd just like to draw upon the main reason for which Leave voters voted as they did. It seems that they voted on the basis of a blend of the issue of immigration and the issue of the economy, and they seem to be using immigration as a means of justification for the economy in the north. I think that's rather... I don't know, I think it's weird because wouldn't you think that if immigration did affect the economy badly, then London would be the first place to fall because London is known as the cultural capital of the world. So don't you think that the economic divide should have been healed before the immigration one? Thank you.
Okay, we're going to come back to the panel. Lots of questions. Richard.
I do want us to leave the EU. I didn't want us to, but now we have made that decision. I do want that to be the course that we go on. And I believe the only way of continuing mixed conversation is by allowing Parliament as much a role in where we go next, because it's only when the opposition put down 170 questions we realise whether the government have got some of the answers to those or not, and you can therefore debate what the consequences will look like, and there are huge and massive consequences. This is a big decision, and I'm allowed, as somebody who is on whether the winning or losing side, to know what that might mean and what those consequences might be, and you've got to therefore allow this to go through a parliamentary route going forward. I don't believe in a second referendum, partly because I genuinely think that we would overwhelmingly now vote to leave in the public. There were lots of people I recognise very heavily that voted to remain out of a kind of fear of what could have happened, and now are telling the pollsters that just get on with it. Like, we probably wanted to leave, but we had this fear. Other people weren't scared, so if we all band together, we can make this work, and they do expect us to make the most of it, so we should, and I don't think a second referendum would be a particularly good idea. I think there might be a different case for finally putting a settlement to the British public, but that is contingent on the idea that you could go back on any agreement that we'd drawn up with the EU. I don't think they would take us back when we got to that point. So there might be a problem in a kind of logical extension of that argument anyway. So we are leaving, but there is some consequence to that. And I would like to hear something from people who've, not just the voters, but the people who led the campaign to leave, about what cooperation would you want to maintain that we currently do through the EU that you do think should continue? And obviously, the Prime Minister has set out the arrest warrant as one of those examples, but there must be others. And I think that it is incumbent on the winners to help heal this process going forward. And I think that is an important part of it. I don't personally believe that plebiscites are a particularly good way of running the country and doing things, but I believe our politics should run as if we're constantly going to have plebiscites, because that sense of how you keep your politics in check, a plebiscite is clearly a very good part of that, and of course how the voters voted and how MPs, if it were down to their own opinions rather than representing their constituents, would vote, is a good reminder of that. And my personal view was the best way to stop there being a referendum and to have stopped us leaving the EU is for those who wanted to remain to have behaved like we were having a referendum 10 years ago and run the kind of public arguments that essentially Nigel Farage had run in the opposite direction for the last 20, 25 years. And we need that kind of public debate on these key issues. So at the end of the day, it doesn't come down to a referendum.
There was some upset on the panel about the question about generations, but it is the case that a lot of young people did not vote. I'm interested to hear from the panel why they think that might have been the case. And also, is there anything to this point about triggering Article 50 in terms of Mick and David's point about having a democratic conversation? Would that be something that needs to happen now, and why? Max?
It's funny, isn't it, how people who agree with the outcome call it a referendum, people who disagree call it a plebiscite. I think you can basically divide the room on that basis. But the question about young people, I mean, I don't think. The reason I was upset, by the way, with what the gentleman was saying is I think that for a lot of this conversation and for a lot of the conversation more generally, words have been put in other people's mouths across a whole scheme of things, from one side and the other, right? And as far as I could hear, nobody on this panel is sat here saying, oh, people don't have a legitimate say, they don't have a right to vote, etc. Of course they do, of course they do. And I have absolutely no sympathy, by the way, for the idea that because an overwhelming majority of those who voted who were under a certain age voted to stay, that somehow they have greater legitimacy because they're going to be alive for a bit longer. Do you know what I mean? There are debates going on in the science stream of this that will tell you that we're all going to live to 300 and something anyway, so it doesn't really make any difference to me. And that argument is nonsense, and I don't believe in lowering the age of suffrage, so on the off chance you might get an advantage in an electoral competition. And actually, we all have to live with decisions that are made by people who came before us. And as a Conservative, that's something I happen to kind of believe in. But I do think just really, really importantly, we have to stop saying that this is what you really believe, this is what you really said, this is what you really think, when that is not what we have said, or that is not what has been argued for. Because that's, we're talking about division, and I started off with some really kind of generic stuff about north-south divide, etc. But actually in this room, it seems to me, the division is very, very real and very raw still, and we're all kind of, and perhaps it's just because I care less that I find this so dispiriting, but we're all kind of very anxious to tell each other what we actually secretly think, when actually maybe we could just listen to what we say we think.
Thanks. Munira?
I completely agree that we need parliamentary scrutiny of the decisions that the government makes, because it's true that people voted for Brexit, but beyond that, what that looks like and how we go forward, how we design our immigration system, what kind of trade we want and what kind of trade deals we want, all that should be subject to parliamentary discussion. There will be parliamentary debate about the repeal of the Communities Act, and I hope there will continue to be discussion about all these issues in the future, and that people can feel engaged in it. On Article 50, though, what people I think it's a bit disingenuous when people say we just want parliamentary scrutiny to debate when Article 50 should be triggered, because really most people who are vaguely political know that actually it's an attempt to block the invocation of Article 50, which Nick Clegg pretty much admitted he wants to try and delay it as long as possible. And that gives the impression to a lot of EU leaders that there is a chance of a second referendum, because as we know in the history of the EU, the plebiscite has been redone so that the people vote the right way, according to the EU. So that's why there's deep suspicion and mistrust on that issue. When should Article 50 be invoked? I would have loved for the government, for David Cameron, to have campaigned for leave. I would have loved for the government to have prepared for the possibility of an outcome of leave. I would have loved for them to have put in place proper thinking, officials, a clear plan. But sadly, that just didn't happen. So it's true that the government arrived newly in power and didn't really know what it was doing. It didn't have a set-out plan. And so that, I think, is why we have this delay. And I can live with it being in March if I think that the momentum will still be there and it will still happen. I can understand that it can take a long time for things to happen. I'm amazed, actually, that the Prime Minister actually put a date on it. When I used to work in London government, we always joked that if we wanted to, if we said we'd do something but we didn't want to do it, we would just say it will happen sometime in the autumn. And that was a vague enough period, and you could always delay it a bit longer. And actually, to give a month is, pretty incredible. But it's absolutely true. We need to hold their feet to the fire, and we have to keep reminding them how the people voted and that there's no let-off.
I just think that it's important to see this from Europe's perspective. In the European model, you cannot have the freedom of movement of goods, services, and capital across Europe that largely benefits Britain without the freedom of movement. Now, it is the case that that freedom of capital that has benefited the city and benefited London has not been properly dispersed. It is the case that the service economy, which has certainly benefited in the EU, is more present in this country than any other country in the European Union. And it's certainly the case that freedom of movement has affected this economy more than many others in Europe. But it is important to get your head around the fact that what will happen when we lose much of that service economy? What will happen given that we haven't got the manufacturing base any longer that we had? The gentleman that talked about neoliberal economics was absolutely right, because it is the Conservatives that set us on that path. And actually rebuilding a manufacturing economy when you can make cheaper goods in other parts of the world is going to be profoundly difficult. I would never ever say that outside the EU, Britain can't prosper. I just suspect it will be several decades before we get to that long-term horizon. And it's the short term I'm worried about. And then on to the issue...
Can I hold you there? And you can do that when the summing up, please.
Back.
Thank you, Mick.
First of all, just as an aside, I agree we shouldn't put words in people's mouths. The point about this debate is you don't have to. They said it. Diane Abbott said that Leave voters are racists. Right? We don't need to make those things up. So, let's have it all out on the table.
She says a lot of things, though.
Yeah. To be fair, she's also the shadow Home Secretary. Anyway, moving on. Somebody said, just because we lost doesn't mean we're not allowed to say you are wrong. That's absolutely right. Free speech is absolutely integral to democracy. These are the two planks that I stand on in every political debate, free speech and democracy. One of the problems with this issue, and this brings us on to immigration, is that we haven't had free speech. The reason that immigration was so important to many Leave voters, and it wasn't, by the way, the top one. If you look at any of the polls, the top one is about sovereignty, about taking control, about democracy. But the reason it was important, for a small minority, I'm sure, was about racism. For most people, it wasn't about 1970s send them back kind of racism. Immigration in this country has become a symbol of the separation of the political class from a large section of the people. Because it isn't that people objected just to mass immigration. They objected to having mass immigration without ever being asked about it. There's been no public debate about mass immigration in this country in the last 20 years. And anybody who tried to raise the issue has been told they're a racist. Or in Gordon Brown's famous words, some bigoted woman.
Thank you. Right, this gentleman has had his hand up for a long
time.
So
if we want to win the argument for immigration and against borders, by the way, we need free speech. We need to win the difficult argument, not assume it. That's why.
Thank you, Mick.
Mick's just said we've never really had free speech. I'd almost argue, given we only had universal suffrage since 28, we had the war when it was suspended. I'd argue we almost haven't really had democracy in this country insofar as we've lived it. We haven't had the situation where our MPs or representatives have been properly connected to the people.
I was one of the ones crying on the streets when the vote happened, for many reasons. My family live in Scotland, and Britain is going to become even further divided with the referendum vote that Nicola Sturgeon is suggesting to happen. What are the English-centric MPs doing to build and heal that divide?
So I understand how the whole point was to take back control from Brussels, but how do we take back control from Westminster? And I was wondering what the policy was and what the panel thought about decentralisation and devolution.
Richard, over to you, please.
I suppose I was going to say, stop thinking Nick Clegg's important. He could barely stop things happening when he was the Deputy Prime Minister. The idea that in a party of 8 people, the Liberal Democrats are going to frustrate anything is quite frankly ridiculous. And this is part of my point they've been making today, is they're putting up these kind of Remainers as somehow, what the levers do we bloody have? We don't have anything. The country is being run by people who are throwing us towards the exit door with absolutely no plan or way forward. I can't tell you what we're doing to leave. I don't know. I'm not part of any of those decisions. But at the moment, there are people who don't even want us to be able to ask the questions about what the plan looks like, how it looks like, because they want to set up the problem as the people who want to remain. Whereas the challenge is what are we going to do? How are we going to do it? I want a level of reassurance, but not unreasonably people who voted to leave want those levels of reassurance. And they should get them, because we've got to go through that next phase of the debate where we see the referendum become reality and that leaving becomes a situation. But we've got to know what that is. And there is many more questions, and we've got to be part of that.
Thank you. Munira.
I'll just make one point, and I want to agree with what Mick said about free speech. The thing that really struck me about the referendum campaign in terms of political parties was that the real opposition in this country is not the Labour Party or the Lib Dems, it's the media. The media is the last institution that actually holds politicians to account and scrutinises their decisions. And you found that with the Leave campaign, essentially, was trying, people running it through the media and through social media to some extent, because the political parties had essentially given up on scrutinising each other. They basically agreed on a similar position. And I think, going forward, absolutely there needs to be debate. Absolutely Remain people should ask their questions, as should Leave people. I think there are lots of people who voted Remain who now do accept the result and do want to move on and make it a success and strike a positive no. But I think if we're relying on our politicians to do the scrutinising, maybe that's not good enough.
Okay, thank you. Max.
Immigration has been raised several times, and I think it's really important to agree with something that Mick said, actually. I think the disconnect that has been allowed to develop between kind of everyday popular consensus around some of the issues that immigration has caused, or real or imagined, frankly, and what politicians think about that and say about that and how prepared they are to engage with that, is that's the real gaping wound at the heart of the gap between our political class and the electorate. And I think if it speaks as well, just to sum up, I think we have to seize the opportunities that are within the decision that we've made. And that it be that tackling some of the inequities of neoliberalism, because actually the European Union was very good at making sure that we all kept running along a particular sort of economic track, or be that around how we ensure that we answer people's concerns around immigration. If we try and leave in a way that makes no difference to anyone, I think we're going to find ourselves in some real trouble.
Thank you. David.
The question about decentralisation and devolution is absolutely spot on. British politicians from all political parties have talked about it for a long time, but get into power and hoard it at the centre. They don't hand it out. A huge challenge. And it's interesting, Munira, when she was working for Boris, was not that keen on power leaving London, really, actually. I just want to do a practical example of the immigration question. We stopped building council houses in Britain in the 1980s. We are not building houses for ordinary people. There is an asset class of baby boomers, particularly in London and the South East, whose houses are worth a fortune, and many people beyond London and the South East, and certainly younger generation, who can't participate in that. I've got to tell you, that has got nothing to do with the EU. Now, I hear many people in Britain who say, the reason we haven't got houses is because you've let all the immigrants in. They've got them. The bottom line is, at the centre, we stopped building houses. We encouraged people to buy their own and did not replace them. The current government hasn't got a policy on council homes, and we aren't really building. Again, it comes back to domestic politics. Power should have been devolved with real money to get building and to build an economy. Instead, we've had an asset class in the centre that's hoarded it and enjoyed it, and now we will live with the consequences of it. But when I let me just finish. When I question where we are, it's because I genuinely don't believe that the folk I see in Westminster of all political parties are really going to be able to fix the problems that the British people voted to leave to fix out in the regions. I don't see it. I don't trust them. That's why I think we're in a God-holy mess. We will be 10, 15 years down the line, and the anger that what you thought you voted for you didn't get is going to be real. And when people laugh, laugh because I raise Hitler, it is because of the nationalism and because of those on the far right who will exploit this. And I genuinely feel that, because when you've seen the rise in hate crime, which has not been discussed, that we've seen, that is not a joke, it is real.
Okay, thank you. Mick?
Okay, so I haven't got any time to reply to the hate crime thing. It's an interesting discussion. I agree entirely about the point over here about we take democracy for granted. It's far more fragile than we imagine, and we need to seize this moment to make our unrepresentative democracy far more representative, and that is the key issue for me, far more important than any details about any EU debate. It's the spirit of democracy that's been awakened by this referendum. In the days when there was a left in this country that was pro-democracy and anti-EU, represented by Tony Benn and Michael Foot used to say that his father told him, when you meet a man, always ask yourself, which side would he have been on at Marston Moor, the decisive battle of the English Revolution? Would he have been for the Parliament, or would he have been for the King? This is one of those moments, right? Which side are we on our Marston Moor today? And we need to take sides with democracy fundamentally if we're going to see any future, any resolution of which direction this country is going.
Can you join me in thanking the panel?